Welcome to the continuing EPIC series UCC Course Approval, Development, and Assessment. In Episode 5, we're going to discuss the basics of teaching and assessing critical thinking. So first we need to think about, what do we teach? What do we teach students in the classroom? First thing we teach, and we all do this to some extent, and we have to, is we teach well-structured problems, or what we're going to call textbook problems. How do we identify these problems as being textbook problems? They're described with a high level of completeness. They can be solved with a high degree of certainty. There's going to be a right answer to a textbook problem. And the experts usually agree on the correct solution. So in terms of our educational goals, students learn information and they learn to reason to get the correct solutions, whether it's a process or just a fact. So here are examples of textbook problems. Converting a unit of measure between its English and metric equivalent, there's going to be a right answer. If you give them a problem, there's going to be an answer that's acceptable and the rest will not. Solving for x in an algebraic equation. Calculating the trajectory of a rocket's flight, there's going to be a correct answer. Now how do we assess? How do we assess textbook problems? In the way that most of us are used to teaching our classes, we're going to assess these with a test. They're going to be multiple choice and there's going to be a right answer. There's going to be an essay and there's going to be a right answer. Or fill in the blank, there's going to be a right answer. So we're all, again, this is the easier part of teaching, is coming up with what do students need to know fact-wise and then testing them on those facts. Now what we're going to focus on and what we want to look at is a higher order of learning with critical thinking. Looking at ill-defined problems. Yes, we do need the facts, we do need those textbook problems, but in order to prepare students for life beyond graduation, not just in the professional life, but also in the personal life, we have to go towards learning-centered teaching, where we're focused on the student, and teaching the student how to solve ill-defined problems. To do that, students have to use many skills and abilities at one time, and our job is to teach them those skills and abilities in order to try to solve, in their own mind, these ill-defined problems. So as Einstein said, education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. So what do ill-structured problems have in common? They cannot always be described with a high degree of completeness. They cannot be resolved with a high degree of certainty. There's not a right answer. The experts will often disagree about the best solution. So there's going to be more than one possible solution to an ill-structured problem. And the educational goal is to learn to construct and defend reasonable solutions. And we have to teach the students how to construct and defend reasonable solutions. Critical thinking examples. The necessity of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. Yes, we did do that. But were there other possibilities, and what are the ramifications of those other possibilities had that not been the choice? It's important for students to think about this, because it's not to say that this type of question may not come up in history in their lifetime. They have to, another example is judging the adequacy of a theoretical proposition. Predicting how to dispose of nuclear waste safely. It's something we have to do, but there are different ways to dispose of nuclear waste, several different methods, and there's strengths and weaknesses to each of those methods, so there's not a set right answer. And determining the social historical significance of art or literature. Again, there's not one single answer to this. There are several possibilities or several solutions that can come from this question. How do we assess this? We develop a paper, a thesis, a project, an oral exam, an interview, or portfolio that's going to assess their critical thinking skills. Now what I want you to notice that's not on this list is a multiple choice test. You cannot test or assess a student on their thinking with a critical thinking with a multiple choice test, because to these questions there is not one right answer. So you may be asking yourself, how do I develop these assignments? What am I looking at when I try to develop these assignments? So you can develop these assignments that are going to ask the students to do the following. We're going to ask them to use the critical thinking rubric, and for you to use the critical thinking rubric when you design your assignment, because that critical thinking rubric will allow us to assess the student's ability to critically think. So when you develop these assignments, you need to be looking at the now world famous Vincennes University critical thinking rubric. So your assignment has to be such that when you look at that assignment and grade the assignment, that you can determine where the student stood in these different domains within the critical thinking rubric. The first one being the explanation of the problem, question, conflict, or issue. Can they see where the issue is? Can you give them articles on nuclear waste disposal, or ask them to go out into the internet? And can they come up with what is the issue there? What is the issue with nuclear waste disposal? Or can you teach them different aspects or different critical events that occurred in history? And then can they go back and pick the one that has the most significance to them and why it has meaning for them, be able to explain that? Or looking at different pieces of art throughout a variety of different time periods and connect those pieces of art and determine what that connection is for them. So they want to give those pieces of art meaning for them and understanding what the relationship is between those. So they have to be able to do that on their own. And again, it's going to be different for every student. It's going to be different for every student. Then the next section of the rubric is evidence. And this is where some of your fact-based stuff comes in. Are they using or making good choices when they are collecting evidence to look at this ill-defined problem? So are they using the right sources? Are they using the evidence correctly when they start formulating their opinion or their solution to this problem or question? The next section is the influences of context and assumptions. Students have trouble with this one. They have to determine what and why is influencing their thinking on this ill-defined problem. And they also have to look at the context of others and how these ill-defined problems influence others, and how what the context is and assumptions is of those other stakeholders in the issue. So again, this is how and why they're thinking what they're thinking. And they can look at cultural and social situations. If they're looking at art, it may be the culture of that time period. The same thing with history. They have to look at the technological issues. When I did a critical thinking skill with embryonic stem cells, and we talked about the technology. They had to understand that and how that could influence their thinking of their viewpoint of that issue, their personal experiences. So they have to share not only what context it is, but they have to explain why. They have to explain why. A lot of times students can say, I think this way because of my religious beliefs or so on, but they can't explain it. And when you look at this section of the rubric, you'll see what makes a good critical thinker is their ability to understand why they're thinking what they're thinking, or why other stakeholders in the situation think what they think. And then here we have the student's position. Are they able to formulate their position using evidence and using context and assumptions? Are they able to formulate their opinion? One of the keys to critical thinking is that they understand the other side of the issue. So if it's a two-sided issue or has multiple possibilities, they're not good critical thinkers until they can explain and appreciate the other side of the issue. So most of our students are very good at telling us what they think is the right answer in their position, and they see the positives of their position, but they also have to be able to explain the other side of the issue or other possibilities. The last section is conclusions and related outcomes. Our students, again, and students in general, are very good at saying, here's what my position is, and here's the positives of the position that I am taking. But what they're not as good at is they also have to understand that there are limits to their position, that there are negatives or consequences to their position. So in this section, they're going to be looking at what are the positives of my position, but what are the weaknesses in my position, and what are the consequences of taking my position or my viewpoint on an issue. So again, when you design your assignment, You want to be looking at this rubric and making sure that what you're asking students to do can be assessed using this rubric. This is just a reminder. We talked about this in an earlier video, that we have mapped the critical and creative thinking for critical and creative thinking. We have mapped the state outcomes for all three areas that fit under or in our critical thinking rubric. Now I'm just showing you this because you're going to have to use it as part of the form, but when you're designing your assignment, you're going to come back to this rubric and use this rubric as your tool to design the assignment. But do remember that those state outcomes are mapped within these sections of the rubric. So by doing the assignment and assessing the assignment using these domains, you are also assessing these state outcomes. So again, this is a little different than we've seen before. Here's the critical, what we're saying are critical thinking state outcomes for humanities, for science, and for social science. But again, designing your assignment, you want to be using this rubric. Now here is the critical thinking assignment checklist. This is what we as a committee are going to be using to make sure that your critical thinking assignment is going to meet our criteria for the rubric and so on. So while using the rubric, when you're designing the assignment, you want to use this critical thinking checklist as you're writing it up on the form. So you're going to have to list the state outcomes that deal with critical thinking. So you can come back to this list, and the first thing you'll do, and I'll show you that in a video, the next video, make sure you're listing for your area the proper state outcomes that will be assessed during this assignment. You're going to describe your assignment. You're also going to go through your assignment goal and how does this assignment fit into the overall goals of the course. We want you to use what you're doing in class. You're probably already doing a lot of your critical thinking exercises. It's just a matter of focusing it and structuring it in such that you can use the rubric. But we want this assignment to be meaningful. We want it to mean something for your course, so you want to make sure that the assignment you're designing works around what you're already doing in your course and is going to help you meet your course goals. Then we'll be looking for a description of assignment specifics and or a plan for accomplishing the assignment. You can't just give the students a bunch of questions and say go answer them. There has to be a description of the assignment and what you're going to do to get to the point that they can answer the questions that you've set up. And then an explanation of the value of this assignment relative to the overall course grade. We want the assignment to have meaning. If it's only worth a very, very, very small percentage of your total class grade, the students aren't going to take it seriously. So we kind of want to have an idea of where you stand with that in terms of meaning, in terms of grading. And then the next section here just goes through, here are the 5 sections of the rubric. We're going to look at those. We're going to look at your write-up, and we just need to be clear that we can see how the assignment you're designing is going to allow you to assess those areas of the rubric. These are just examples. These will be on YouTube. These are just an example of an assignment that I use. You got examples when you went to the professional development. There's several things online you can use. And again, I'll be doing a second video which will show you an example of a couple people's write-ups of their assignment.